All right, let's go to part 2. Narrative interviewing for performance ethnography. If you need to take a breath and a break, this is a great time to do so because we're going to move from understanding the methodology to applying it. First, let's talk about phenomenological interviewing. Phenomenological interviewing is focused on finding how one person lives their reality, understands who they are through the stories they tell about themselves. Now, you never know how long a phenomenological interview of someone's own stories and life and histories is going to take. I've had interviews that were very focused on the topic that I was interviewing them about that took 30 minutes. I've had others that we had to begin at the beginning and it took 3 hours to get to the end. Now, in this kind of situation, if you do have someone who you want to interview, but you don't have a specific story that you know they're going to tell, you can ask them, we'll start at the beginning, tell me your life story. And as you record that whole story, you take notes of moments that are going to work for what we're doing. And remember, because we're performing for children, it needs to be a G-rated story. It can't have drugs, it can't have alcohol, it can't have sex, it can't have any glorifying of behavior that would be considered criminal. So those are things to be thinking about as you're choosing a story out of this person's life history to tell. So they might start with their whole life, and then you find some possibilities of stories that would work, and then you go back and ask them to tell you that story again and fill in the details. And this can happen over the course of one interview, or they might be a little fatigued. You might need to come back in a few days. So give yourself time if you're going to do a life history interview to make sure you can find some stories within that life history that could then be possibilities that you can come back and ask more about. Some of you might say, actually, there is a story that I know would be perfect, and that person might sit down with you, and after building some rapport and after being able to tell the story, you can ask for some more details, and it might be finished in 30 minutes. So it just depends on where you are. No matter what, make sure that story is recorded. Now, make sure you're listening, reflecting, and honoring their experience. Let your monologue grow out of your interviewee. Don't force a monologue based on how you want this story to be. How do we do this? First, listen more, talk less. Do not interrupt your person. Let your interviewee tell their story, but have a notebook and take notes about things you want to know more about. So if there is a character that seems to be a passing addition to the story, but you care about that character and you think they might be a possibility, someone you want to perform in the story, ask more about them. I'll give an example. One of our students did a story of her father's life growing up on a farm in Ireland. And in the first rendition of the story, his uncle was just a passing farmer. It was a story about her father sneaking into the pig pen and then the pig giving birth to lots of piglets and him being worried. And so at first we said, well, let's make this person come to life. Explore, don't probe. And what I mean by that is if you see something seems to be uncomfortable and that's not the direction they want to take the story, you're not an investigative reporter, you are not an attorney interrogating a witness, you are a phenomenological researcher looking to create a performance of narrative for an audience. So instead, ask them to give you more information about different people, about the setting, help it all come to life. And this becomes very important. Again, I'll go back to the story about Ireland. At first, the student didn't think about that an Irish farm possibly looks different than an American Southern farm. And she had to go back and say, well, can you describe what it was like? And she was so surprised to find how everything was made of stone and how the house was laid out and how the different barns were laid out. And it did look so different than how she'd imagined it growing up in rural North Carolina. So make sure you help them help you paint a picture for your audience. Don't assume anything. Ask them to describe the setting for you so you can set it up for the children later. Avoid leading questions. Don't say, I bet your uncle was a jerk. Ask, well, how did you feel about your uncle? How did you see them? And let them describe. And one little thing you can do is consider role play. Well, can you pretend I'm your uncle? How would you talk to your uncle? And so you can kind of see how their relationship is based on the whole situation. Like, what would you say about your uncle if he were here right now and you were telling about how you were feeling while you're in the pig pen? And that can help you in some ways find the character. Also, make sure that if the person you're talking to wants you to chat with them, you don't say, sorry, my professor told me to listen more and talk less, so I'm not answering your questions. Answer their questions politely, succinctly, and then focus back on them. Don't focus on, well, what do you remember? Because that can sometimes be pressure. Ask them how it feels. What was it like? Because the feelings, how a space made us feel, the emotions, those stay with us sometimes more than exactly what day of the week it was or what year it was. That doesn't matter so much. We can sometimes fill in those details even ourselves if they don't remember with some research. But what matters is, what was it like? What did it smell like? What did it look like? How did it make you feel? Explore laughter or emotions to make sure you grasp the experience from their perspective. Sometimes you'll hear laughter and it's not that they think it's funny, it's that they're a little uncomfortable, a little nervous. So you can say, you just laughed, what were you laughing at? And they can say, oh, well, I guess I was just remembering how embarrassed I was. You're like, oh. And so instead of it being funny, it was actually embarrassing. So there's things to know, and you don't know for sure until you ask. Tolerate silence. Sometimes someone just needs a moment to collect, to process. And I know silence can be uncomfortable. It can be agitating. We can feel like we need to fill it. But let a person be silent as they collect and decide where to go next. Okay, so now we've had a wonderful interview and we're writing the story. Who is this character? Get to know them. And one thing about the Hawktail players that is different than traditional performance ethnography is sometimes we take some license to create a character. And you'll read about this in the readings for class as well next week, but I want you to be thinking about how are we going to make this character? Is it going to be verbatim based on how they told the story in this moment? Or if it's a story about childhood, are we going to make a childlike character? Or if it is a grandparent as a young adult, are we going to make a young adult version of this particular interviewee? So we have that license. So get to know them to see how you might be creating a character for the monologue. What is the when, where, how, and why, right? Because we're going to create a story. When did this happen? What is the location? How did this story take place? That involves the characters that were there, the motivations, and then why? What do we learn from it that you want to share with the children? You'll also find your monologue structure. Sometimes you'll tell it all in the first person as that character. Sometimes you'll want to make a more dramatic sort of performance where you not only perform the character you interviewed, but also these other characters in the story. And a lot of that just depends on your comfort, your preference, and who these other characters are. And finding who your character is through your ability to embody. And part of this is going to be your range as a performer. And part of this is also going to be how the children are reading your body. You need to be very careful when you are performing a character that is a different demographic than yourselves. If you're performing someone who's a different race, if you're performing someone who's a different gender, a different nationality, all of those things matter. And we need to make sure we're being respectful and aware of power relations that surface when we are telling a story based on how our culture, how these children, how the broader structure of society is understanding different identities. And so your identity and the participant's identity are in a dynamic tension that we're going to figure out through our workshops and make sure we have a respectful, strong, ethical performance that embodies being an empathetic world traveler. Here are just some examples that you're going to see over the course of the semester. I'm going to show you some performances that my students did. They embodied the scripts that came from my research up on stage. There's some with people who identified as physically disabled professionals, some that identified as elders with memory loss, some who identified as living with seizure disorders. And while all of the scripts performed verbatim, we did those in different ways. And you'll be able to look at some of those. We're going to watch E. Patrick Johnson and Anna DeVere Smith, who in their interviews of Black gay men from the South, and then Anna DeVere Smith, the one you're going to watch is people in our healthcare system pre the Affordable Care Act and what it was like to be in that setting. And you'll see how they stay close to the actual structure of the interview and the context to recreate that setting and that interview verbatim. Heather Carver had her students perform interviews of women who were survivors of domestic violence. And so we're going to be looking at those and seeing how they had a thematic structure and a dramatic performance they toured. And Eve Ensler, who created the Vagina Monologues, and rather than some of these more verbatim scripts, she created composite characters, which means she would combine a lot of different inspirations from the interviews to create the show. And sometimes that took the place of a chorus, sometimes that took the place of poetry, sometimes that took the place of verbatim narrative. So you'll see all these different perspectives on how these stories can be created. So that's our method. That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be adapting performance ethnography, specifically a personal narrative interviewing, and we're going to become the Hawktail players. And we will start brainstorming stories, who you're going to interview and what you might interview them about. I'll talk to you soon. As always, reach out with questions. I love to hear from you, and I will see you soon.